California burned 4.2 million acres in a single season. The same land had not burned like that in 10,000 years. That is not a coincidence. That is a crime scene, and the evidence has been sitting in the soil this entire time. Welcome to the investigation nobody opened in 1950. The case file is thick charcoal layers, pollen cores, satellite imagery, and oral history spanning 400 generations. The subject: controlled burns, Karuk fire science, and the question of why it vanished. Not gradually, not naturally, in a single legal stroke. We are going to work this case the way any good investigator would. Start with the body. Work backward to the cause. The body is 4.2 million acres of scorched California earth, larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Imagine driving non-stop from Los Angeles to San Francisco and setting fire to everything visible from that highway. That is the scale of what burned in 2020. And the satellite images do not lie. Pull up the before image: green ridgelines, intact canopy, the Klamath River threading through forested hills. Pull up the after image: gray, ash gray, from ridge to ridge. But forensic investigators do not stop at the burn scar. They ask what conditions made the burn possible. And that question takes us somewhere wildfire coverage almost never goes. It takes us 10,000 years back into the same soil. Paleoecologists, scientists who read the ancient history buried in soil, have a specific tool for this. It is called charcoal stratigraphy. In California's Sierra Nevada, those layers go down 10,000 years. Not one thick layer, not random scatter, thin, deliberate, repeating bands. The pattern is too consistent for lightning, too seasonal, too spatially precise. Stevens and colleagues at the University of California confirmed this in 2007, Deliberate Human Fire Management, continuous for approximately 10,000 years. 10,000 years of controlled burns. If each year were 1 second, that is nearly 3 hours of uninterrupted practice. The length of a feature film. 3 times over. Now add the pollen cores. Sediment pulled from Sierra Nevada lake beds shows specific plant communities: tan oak, beargrass, hazel, maintained in stable proportions for millennia. Those proportions do not maintain themselves. Forests, left alone, behave differently. Something was managing them. The charcoal record tells us what? Fire, seasonal, deliberate, recurring. The earth kept receipts. This is where the investigation gets interesting, because we also have witnesses, living witnesses, and their testimony matches the forensic record exactly. The Karuk people, whose name means upriver people, have lived along the Klamath River in Northern California since time beyond their own counting. Their ancestral territory covers approximately 1.38 million acres of river canyon, ridge, and old-growth forest. And for every generation the soil recorded burning, the Karuk recorded burning too. Not in written documents. In something older and more precise: oral history, ceremony, and practice knowledge passed hand to hand across 400 generations. To the Karuk, fire is not a land management technique. It is a relative, a working relationship between people and land that is inseparable from Karuk identity itself. The right to burn was not a resource policy. It was the right to exist as Karuk people on Karuk land. That distinction matters enormously for this investigation, because what was suppressed was not a technique. It was a relationship. And relationships, once severed, do not resume on command. The Karuk burned tan oak groves to increase acorn production. They burned to maintain bare grass and hazel, the raw materials of some of the most technically sophisticated basketry in North America. They burned to create habitat corridors for deer, elk, and salmon-bearing streams. Each burn was timed. Each burn was placed. Each burn was read from the land itself. The Yurok, whose reservation straddles the lower Klamath River, practiced the same relational fire science for the same duration. Their wildlife department has documented what happened to tan oak, a keystone food source, when burning stopped around 1850. The groves did not simply go unmanaged. They declined, measurably, species by species. The Miwok people of the central Sierra Nevada foothills managed black oak specifically for acorn production, their primary caloric staple. Tree ring studies in Yosemite Valley, ancestral Miwok territory, document fire return intervals of 8 to 22 years, consistent for centuries before Euro-American settlement. 8 to 22 years, like clockwork, like maintenance. Because it was maintenance. 3 nations, 1 science, 10,000 years. In 1793, a Spanish missionary and explorer named José Longinos Martínez wrote something in his California journal that his superiors apparently did not consider important. He observed people of Alta California deliberately setting fires to manage land and game. He recorded it as a curiosity, an odd custom. He did not understand he was watching the oldest active ecological science on the continent. That is the first written European witness in our case file. He saw it. He did not stop it. Not yet. That came later, with a different kind of document entirely. The land the Karuk, Yurok, and Miwok maintained was not wilderness in any Western sense of the word. It was a managed landscape. Precise as a garden. Complex as an ecosystem can be. Picture the Klamath River Canyon in the 1840s, the last decade before the legal machinery turned. Tan oak groves open and producing at intervals, not choked by competing understory. The smell of char on the ridge, not catastrophic, not choking the clean, mineral scent of recent, low fire moving through dry grass. Smoke rising in thin columns from hillsides above the river. Deliberate, controlled. This was not a landscape waiting to explode. This was a landscape being tended. But what came next? Nobody teaches this part. 1850. California achieves U.S. statehood on September 9th. Within the first decade, a series of state-sanctioned massacres, land theft policies, and legal instruments began dismantling tribal territorial control. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians passed in 1850. The name is almost impossible to read with a straight face. Effectively stripped tribal nations of the legal standing to act on their own land. No standing on the land, no legal right to burn it. Somewhere in the 1850s and 1860s, the specific year was never recorded because no one thought it important enough to record Karuk families along the Klamath lit their seasonal burns for what would be the last time. They did not know it was the last time. They did not know. The tan oak groves they walked away from had been managed this way for 400 generations. Within 50 years, those same slopes would be choked with fuel no one was permitted to clear. That is not a metaphor. That is a documented ecological trajectory. Pritchard and colleagues, writing in the peer-reviewed journal Ecosphere in 2017, quantified what happened next. Pre-European fire return intervals in many California forest types, 5 to 35 years. By 2017, many of those same areas had not experienced fire in over 100 years. Fuel loads dry wood, dead brush, accumulated duff estimated at 3 to 10 times pre-colonial levels in some zones. 3 to 10 times. Imagine a building where no one has taken out the trash for a century. Now imagine someone locked the maintenance crew out on day 1. That is what happened to California's forests. The Karuk were not suppressing fire. They were doing the maintenance. And the maintenance crew had been locked out since 1850. But the U.S. government was not finished. In 1911, the U.S. Forest Service formally adopted a total fire suppression policy across all federal lands, not just discouraging indigenous burning, making any fire on federal land a federal offense. The Klamath River region Karuk ancestral territory was federal land. The suppression was now legally airtight. But even that was not enough. 1935. The U.S. Forest Service issues what fire historians would come to call the 10 a.m. policy. The 10 a.m. policy mandated that every wildfire be suppressed by 10 a.m. the morning after it was reported. Every fire, no exceptions. No matter what the Karuk had known about that particular slope for 300 years. The fuel is now building, the maintenance crew is locked out, and now even the smoke detector is illegal. The question the investigation now has to answer is this: what does a landscape look like after 100 years of no maintenance? The 2020 satellite images will tell us, but first, the evidence gets stranger. Fire historian Stephen Pine documented the consequence of the 10 a.m. policy in his foundational 1982 study, Fire in America. The policy in force for approximately 42 years before the USDA began reconsidering suppression doctrine in the 1970s contributed to fuel accumulations that now make many California fires burn at 2 to 4 times the intensity of pre-colonial fires. 2 to 4 times the intensity. Not hotter because of climate alone, hotter because of a century of accumulated fuel that Karuk burning had historically kept in check. The land was not just drier. It was loaded. Fire behavior analysts at CAL FIRE reassessed their models in 2020. Their models, built on decades of fire data, had never been calibrated for what they were seeing. Flame lengths beyond their charts, crown fire rates their software could not compute. They were not watching a wildfire in the historical sense. They were watching something the land had not produced in 10,000 years. A catastrophic exhalation, a century's worth of silence, finally speaking. 100 years of held breath. By 2020, the USDA Forest Service's aerial surveys had counted 129 million dead trees standing in California's forests. 129 million. If you laid those trees end to end at 60 feet each, they would circle the earth approximately 29 times. Every one of those dead trees was fuel. Every one of those dead trees represented a burn that never happened, a maintenance cycle broken sometime between 1850 and 1911. The Karuk would not have let a single one of those trees stand long enough to die and accumulate. That is not a spiritual claim. That is a documented land management outcome confirmed by peer-reviewed science. Frank Lake, a USDA Forest Service research ecologist and a Karuk descendant, published a technical report in 2013 that many fire scientists consider a landmark document. Lake's work did something that had never been formally done at that scale. It placed Karuk oral history and traditional ecological knowledge directly alongside Western fire ecology data. The findings were not approximately similar. They were measuring the same outcomes. What the Karuk called caring for the land, and what fire scientists call fuel reduction and habitat mosaic maintenance, described identical physical processes. The knowledge had never been lost. It had only been made illegal. That is the central document in this cold case. Not a confession, not a statute. A scientific paper that proved the suppression was not based on evidence. There was no Western scientific finding in 1911 that Karuk burning was harmful. There was no ecological study in 1935 that justified the 10 a.m. policy. There was only the assumption unexamined, culturally confident that indigenous land management was primitive and that modern suppression was superior. The land spent 100 years proving that assumption catastrophically wrong, and the proof came due in August of 2020. September 9, 2020, California's 170th statehood anniversary. On that exact date, the August complex fire crossed 1 million acres. It became the first recorded gigafire in California history. 1 million acres equal to the combined land area of Rhode Island and Delaware in a single fire. The anniversary date is not symbolic, it is documentary. The state that was built partly on the legal suppression of Karuk burning celebrated its birthday by burning in a way that had not happened for 10,000 years. The land does not forget. It accumulates. And in 2020, it collected everything that was owed. The smoke from the August complex turned San Francisco's sky orange at noon. Not red, not hazy. Orange, the color of a star, seen through the wrong atmosphere. People photographed it on their phones because no one had words for what they were seeing. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. The 2020 fire season did not come from nowhere. It came from a specific sequence of decisions, each one building on the last, each one removing one more layer of the maintenance system. Let us go back to the soil because the forensic record is still talking. The charcoal bands in the Sierra Nevada confirm what the pollen cores show: a pre-colonial burn cycle in many forest types running every 5 to 35 years, low intensity, spreading across a landscape already thinned by the previous burn. Low fuel load means low fire. The fire does its work and moves on. Remove the burn cycle. Stop the maintenance. Now fuel accumulates for 35 years instead of being cleared every 10. Now fuel accumulates for 50 years, for 70, for 100. The fuel load is no longer what a low-intensity cultural burn was designed to handle. It has become something else entirely, something the land had no biological experience with. The trees had not evolved for this. Their bark had not evolved for this. Their roots had not evolved for this. 10,000 years of moderate recurring fire had shaped California's plant communities to survive moderate recurring fire. Not to survive a century of silence followed by an inferno. That is the forensic mechanism. That is the pathology. The land did not forget how to burn safely. It was denied the burns that kept burning safe. A century of enforced quiet. Now look at the satellite imagery from a different angle. Before 2020, dense, unbroken canopy across vast stretches of the Sierra Nevada and Northern California ranges. In a traditionally managed landscape, that canopy would not be unbroken. It would be mosaic open patches, transitional edges, dense groves, meadow corridors. That mosaic is what the Karuk call a healthy land, what fire ecologists call a fuel break. What the satellite images showed instead was 100 years of crown closure canopy so thick that when fire arrived, it did not stay on the ground. It went up, into the crowns. And from crown to crown it moved faster than any historical California fire record had measured. Cal Fire's models had never seen it because the conditions that produced it had never existed. Not in the instrumental record, not in the tree rings, not in the charcoal layers. The 2020 fires were burning in a way that was new to the land itself. New in the worst possible sense. Fuel loads the landscape had never carried, intensity it had never reached, scale it had not seen in 10,000 years. And yet the knowledge that would have prevented it was sitting in Karuk oral tradition, in Karuk ceremony, in the land management plan the Karuk tribe published in 2004. Formally documented, formally available, formally ignored. The 2004 Karuk tribe land management plan called for the restoration of cultural burning across approximately 1 million acres of ancestral territory. 1 million acres of maintained land might not have stopped 2020, but the case file suggests it would have changed it. The 2021 peer-reviewed study by Sharma and colleagues published in Nature Sustainability estimated that reintroducing prescribed burns at historical frequencies could reduce high-severity wildfire risk by approximately 64% in some Sierra Nevada forest types. 64%. That number represents the difference between a crisis and a catastrophe, between orange skies and blue ones, between 4.2 million acres and something a Cal Fire model could actually calculate. But to understand why 64% of something was not available in 2020, go back to the mechanism of erasure. Not the policy, the human cost of the policy. Consider what it means to know something for 400 generations and then be legally barred from doing it. The knowledge does not just survive in texts. It survives in practice, in muscle memory, in ceremony, in the reading of smoke and wind and season that cannot be fully transferred by description alone. When Karuk families were forced from their burning grounds in the 1850s and 1860s, they were not only losing land, they were losing the conditions under which the knowledge stayed alive. A botanist who cannot enter the lab eventually loses the feel of the work. A fire practitioner who cannot burn eventually loses the read of the land that tells them where and when and how much. The Karuk did not lose the knowledge. They kept it. In oral history, in ceremony, in the memory of elders passed to children who could not yet practice what they were taught. But the landscape they were being trained to read was changing underneath them year by year as fuel built and the mosaic closed. The land the Karuk had read for 10,000 years was being replaced by something new, a landscape none of them had ever managed, because it had never before existed. That is the deepest forensic finding in this investigation. It is not just that the burns were suppressed. It is that the suppression created conditions that required a different kind of burn to fix one that is harder to do safely precisely because the fuel loads are so much higher. The erasure was self-reinforcing. Stop the maintenance. The buildup makes the maintenance harder. The harder maintenance becomes, the easier it is to justify not doing it. And the fuel keeps building. Until 2020. Bill Tripp, Director of Natural Resources for the Karuk tribe, put it as plainly as this investigation could ask. He said, "We have managed our land since time immemorial. Fire is not our enemy, it is a relative. What happened when they took that away from us is what you're seeing burn on the news. Fire is a relative. That is not a metaphor. For the Karuk, that is a precise description of a relationship that has specific responsibilities, specific protocols, and specific consequences when abandoned. The consequence is not abstract. It is measured in acres and degrees Fahrenheit. 4.2 million acres. Flame temperatures that CAL FIRE's instruments had to be recalibrated to measure. That is the consequence of severing a relationship that ran 10,000 years without breaking. The land remembered the relationship was supposed to exist. It just had no one to fulfill it. There is one more document in this case file that the investigation cannot overlook. It is not a government report. It is not a scientific paper. It is a dendrochronological record, the tree rings of black oaks in Yosemite Valley. The rings show burn scars from fires that swept through at intervals of 8 to 22 years, for centuries. Regular, seasonal, managed. Then, sometime in the mid to late 1800s, the scars stop. Just stop. Like a heartbeat that flatlines. After the last scar, the rings show something else, accelerated growth. Dense wood. Trees, competing for canopy space in ways that had not happened in the previous centuries of the record. Because without fire thinning the understory, everything grew, and not in the mosaic pattern the Miwok had maintained. In a tangled, fuel-heavy mass that the tree rings recorded faithfully, ring by ring, year by year. Growing toward 2020. Growing toward the orange sky above San Francisco at noon. Growing toward the August complex, the first gigafire in California history, on the state's 170th birthday. The trees kept the record. The trees were always keeping the record. And now they are ash. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. Here is what makes this a cold case and not just a history lesson. The knowledge is not gone. Frank Lake's 2013 report confirmed what the Karuk had maintained through 150 years of legal suppression. The framework survived. The oral tradition survived. The ceremonial memory survived. What the suppression could not do, despite everything, was erase 400 generations of accumulated understanding. But the landscape it applies to has changed. The Klamath River Canyon today carries fuel loads 3 to 10 times higher than anything the Karuk burning cycle was designed to manage safely. The reed of the land that Karuk practitioners carry the knowledge of where the fire wants to go, what it needs, what it will do now, has to contend with a landscape loaded by a century of suppression. This is the cold case's most unsettling finding. The knowledge survived, but the conditions it was built for did not. The suppression did not just stop the burns, it changed the terrain on which the knowledge operates. That is a form of damage that no policy document fully captures. You cannot write a law that restores what was lost in the Klamath Canyon between 1850 and 2020. You can only begin again in a landscape that is harder to read because it has been changed by the silence. Frank Lake is still working, still publishing, still bridging the two knowledge systems that describe the same fire, the same forest, the same land. The Karuk tribe's Department of Natural Resources is still writing land management plans, still calling for restoration of cultural burning across the territory, still carrying the knowledge that was made illegal and kept anyway. In 2023, the largest dam removal project in United States history took place on the Klamath River. 4 dams removed, 400 miles of salmon habitat reopened. The salmon are returning to waters they had not reached in over a century. And the Karuk are watching the land around those waters with the same eyes that have always read it, asking what it needs, what it is telling them, how the relationship can be resumed. Fire is part of that conversation. The case file is not closed. It is being written, right now, by the people who kept the knowledge alive when keeping it alive was against the law. The reed of the land that Karuk practitioners carry, the knowledge of where the fire wants to go, what it needs, what it will do, now, has to contend with a landscape that has been loaded by a century of suppression. And the Karuk are watching the land around those waters with the same eyes that have always read it, asking what it needs, what it is telling them, how the relationship can be resumed. Fire is part of that conversation.